This week on Words and Numbers, James is indisposed and apologizes for his absence. And with his absence, we also miss out on the foolishness of the week. And if you write in lots of email, I imagine you could convince him to give you a double dose next time. This week, we're talking about July 2nd and why it should be considered as important as July 4th.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Rob McDonald joins us this time of year, has joined us many times in the past to talk about the founding, which of course is the natural thing come July. Rob is professor of history at West Point. He is author of Confounding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image in His Own Time. He's edited 6 books, most recently Revolutionary Prophecies, The Founding and America's Future with Peter Onuf. Rob's opinions are his own and do not reflect his employer, so too my opinions are my own and do not reflect my employer. Rob, welcome back to Words and Numbers.
It's great to be with you, Ant.
Rob, James had the idea for this episode, and he said, let's talk about July 2nd. Everybody talks about July 4th. What's special about July 2nd? Why should we be talking about it?
Well, James is in league with John Adams, who predicted that July 2nd would be our great national holiday of independence, because it was on that day that the Continental Congress voted to approve Richard Henry Lee's resolution that these united colonies are and of right ought to be independent states. So that resolution was given the thumbs up on July 2nd, effectively declaring us independent. The Declaration of Independence was then debated and edited, and that was approved on July 4th. But I think because the parchment on the Declaration has July 4th, 1776 in big print on the top, we've just found that irresistible as the day to celebrate. And I'm glad that we do, because, of course, it's not just the act of independence that we celebrate as Americans. It's the principles on which our country was established. And the Declaration does such a wonderful job of laying those out.
And so I guess it's nowadays, if this were to happen today, we would all know it immediately. But with communication as it was then, I would imagine there were parts of the colonies that didn't realize that we had declared independence for some time after July 4.
It took weeks. Boston didn't receive news, I believe, until July 18th, for example. And I assume, people down in Georgia learned at a similar time. And Abigail Adams received a letter from John that he had written on July 2nd, probably about that time. And I can't let this pass without getting in this great John Adams quote. He said that July the 2nd will be celebrated by succeeding generations as a great anniversary, and the day of deliverance, with pomp and parade, shows, we would say, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. And it's great because that's what we do. But again,
Right.
We do that on July 4th.
Tell me this. I was recently watching a documentary on Thomas Jefferson, and it struck me. Let me do it differently. I always think of the founding as this is the point at which Americans got together and said, okay, we're declaring independence from England. And in watching this documentary, I'm struck by a couple things. One, there was a significant portion of the population of Americans who actually did not want to declare independence.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any, I guess my first question is, do you have any sense of how that broke down in terms of the populace at large?
I mean, it's difficult to provide a percentage with any accuracy. They didn't have, public polling back then, that sort of thing. But there were a good number of people who either wanted to remain with Great Britain or thought that we needed to give diplomacy more time. We needed to, not jump off this cliff. Or as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, a member of the Continental Congress, said, We were about to brave the storm in a skiff made of paper. A skiff being a boat made of paper, right? This is a dicey thing. And when they pledged to each other in the Declaration their lives and fortunes and sacred honor, those words had real meaning because they were putting all those things at risk if this doubtful experiment, as Jefferson later described it, went badly.
How hard was it to pull this off? And by that I mean, you've got the founding fathers who are representing various colonies. They not only would they have to come together and convince each other that this is the direction we should go, but they've got to convince their constituents as well. And I'm sure there are other parties involved who don't fit into either category who need to be convinced. How heavy of a lift was this?
I suppose we should point out that the War for Independence began more than a year earlier. I mean, it was on April 19th, 1775, that the British, rode their troops to Charlestown and then marched them 18 miles from Boston, first through Lexington and then to Concord, where their mission was to secure the arms and ammunition of the Massachusetts militia. Fortunately for us, word got out, about 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, the lanterns in Boston's North Church, and and William Dawes and Paul Revere mounted their horses and rode into the countryside, warning that the redcoats were coming out, and other men got on horseback and did the same. So the British mission failed on April 19th, and they didn't pacify the countryside. What they did do was ignite a revolution, and it became one somewhat slowly. I mean, the fighting continued, but it took Americans a while to decide that this was, in fact, going to be a war for independence.
How interesting, because you're saying that, and as you're saying it, I'm thinking, well, it's taking them a while to shift from the reality of war to this is what the war is for. But we did a similar thing with the Civil War. It was only later, after the genesis of the war, that it became about slavery.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I think we could point to some significant events that took place in 1775 and 1776 that pushed Americans increasingly toward independence. In July of 1775, the Continental Congress, I should say, passes what came to be known as the Olive Branch Petition that was addressed directly at the king. And they learned in the fall that George III refused to even read it, let alone respond to it, because he didn't recognize the legitimacy of the Continental Congress as a governing body. They also learned that late in 1775, George III signed off on a bill that they thought was just beyond the pale. It was called the Prohibitory Act. And this measure essentially said that American vessels on the high seas were open targets for both the Royal Navy and even English privateers, pirates, right? Who could seize the ships, seize their cargoes, and impress their crew members into service for the British. So they're treating us like a foreign country. And many people began to observe, I mean, look what the British are doing. A government, as the Glorious Revolution of 1688 established, a government exists to protect individuals' rights to life and liberty and property. But wherever we look, we see the British government violating Americans' rights to life and liberty and property. And that had been going on for a long time. I mean, arguably, ever since the Stamp Act of 1765, the first big example of taxation without representation. But as the war began, events accelerated. And in January of 1776, you have Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, which is published in multiple editions because it's so popular. And it really makes a case for independence in very clear, very unequivocal, very forceful and logical terms. And, as the spring rolls on, more and more people in the Continental Congress come to the conclusion that the chances for reconciliation are almost impossibly remote. The Virginians in May, the Virginia Convention, their elected assembly, the House of Burgesses had been dissolved by the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, down in Virginia. So the members of the House of Burgesses reconstituted themselves as this extra legal body, the Virginia Convention. In May, they were instructing their delegates, it's time for independence. And that's why Virginian Richard Henry Lee rose up on the floor of the Continental Congress on June 7th with his resolution, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states.
In a weird way, at least leading up to the start of the War for Independence, Americans considered themselves Englishmen more than the king considered them Englishmen.
It's very true. I mean, there's an old story about the American Revolution, the way that we used to understand it before maybe the 1970s and the 1980s. People used to assume that we arrived in the 1600s as Englishmen, but as the generations passed, Americans and English people grew apart, and we had just become different, and the time had come for us to strike off on our own. Historians now emphasize that actually it seems the opposite is true. I mean, many of the original 17th century settlers were outcasts of various sorts, right? Religious refugees like the Pilgrims or the Puritans or later the Quakers. And yet, once you get into the 18th century, Americans seem increasingly conscious of and proud of their identity as English people. And they did this in various ways. They expressed this Englishness through the clothing that they wore, the food and the tea that they drank, the way they furnished their homes. George Washington, as a young man, one of the things that he does when he inherits the Mount Vernon estate is he basically resides Mount Vernon and paints it with paint that's mixed with sand to make it seem like Mount Vernon is this stone English country estate made of stone blocks. They're very conscious of their Englishness, and they think that Great Britain is great. Great, not only because it's the world's most powerful nation, as it proved itself to be by defeating France in the 7 Years' War, not only because it's the world's richest nation, but not coincidentally, it's the world's freest nation. They loved the fact that Britain was reestablished in the Glorious Revolution on the principles that John Locke laid out in his 2 treatises on government, that the purpose of government is to secure individual rights, and both natural rights to life, liberty, property, safety, happiness, as well as the civil rights that they enjoyed as Englishmen, like the right to a trial by a jury of your peers. All of those rights were being increasingly violated in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as we called it. And that was so alarming because they wanted so much to be English, because to be English meant to be free. But, as events transpired, it became clear to them that to be English was not to be free if you were a colonist. And if they valued their freedom, they needed to strike out on their own.
Did you tell me at one time that at the same time that this is going on, that the American colonists don't enjoy the full rights, the full representation that would be accorded Englishmen, that at this same point in history, the crown was according such rights to, and I forget whether you said it was the Irish or the Scottish. Am I correct?
I think you're thinking of the French Canadians. So,
Oh, really?
One of the really obnoxious laws that Britain passed in 1774 was the Quebec Act. And I mean, this struck Americans as an example of like utter corruption and proof that the British were really rooting against them. So the colonial charters frequently gave the colonies a claim to land to their west. And, there were no limits upon these claims because we really didn't understand the geography of North America. But if you visit Colonial Williamsburg, they have on display in many of the restored houses there this framed map that shows Virginia's boundary going all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And the same with Pennsylvania, the same with the Carolinas. And what the Quebec Act did was it took all of the land in what would become the Northwest Territory. So essentially north of the Ohio River up to the Great Lakes. It gave control of that land to the colony of Quebec, which of course Americans fighting with the English had conquered from France between 1754 and 1763. And these French Canadians, weren't English. They were a conquered people. I mean, the British are clearly trying to ensure that they will acquiesce to British rule, and they're treating them with a carrot rather than a stick. But from our perspective, this was a horrible thing because land that we claimed, land that Americans wanted to expand into, now was controlled essentially by people they regarded as foreigners.
And am I correct that there was an opportunity at some point for either Quebec or perhaps it was Nova Scotia to become the 14th colony?
Yes, yeah. So back to June 7th, which leads directly to July 2nd. When Richard Henry Lee put forth his resolution, it included three specific things. One was independence. The second was we need to draft a constitution for ourselves. And the third was we need to engage in diplomatic relations with foreign nations to seek their recognition. The Constitution, of course, became the Articles of Confederation, which had been fully drafted by 1777. And it extended an open invitation to what we would call Canada to come and join us as the 14th colony. The Canadians, I suppose, bravely have resisted our efforts to liberate them for many, many years. But one of the things that we do in the early part of the War for Independence is, we sent a force into Canada, essentially invading them, and we would, attempt the same thing again in the War of 1812. But yeah, bravely, the Canadians have resisted our overtures.
I want to, you mentioned Washington, and I want to go back to him for a second. He's, of course, revered as, the father of the country and the general that led our efforts in the War of Independence. I've read a biography of his. In fact, I ran it by you because I found it fascinating. You said basically it was on the up and up. And I came away from this biography kind of with a nagging feeling that, I don't mean to take anything away from him, but not that he was a brilliant general so much as the English just gave up. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is, but I think it reflects the brilliance of Washington's strategy during the American Revolution. Even back then in the 18th century, people were describing it as a Fabian strategy. So Quintus Fabius Maximus was this Roman general who famously chose his battles wisely and refused to put his army at undue risk. And I think Washington understood that if we pursued that sort of strategy, if we could make this war drag on, that time was on our side, right? The British somehow needed to find a way to win this war. We just had to avoid losing it. So if we could, keep our army safe and in the field, engage with the British in battle when it made sense and when it seemed like we had a decent chance of winning a victory, over time, the cost of the war would pile up and the British political will to continue it would wear out. And indeed, that's what happens. I mean, in 1781, after the battle at Yorktown, where Lord Cornwallis had been ordered to move his army to try to turn Yorktown into a deep water port for the British Navy. Yorktown's on a peninsula, so Lafayette got word to George Washington that the British, had put themselves in this fairly precarious position, and he and the French forces under the command of General Rochambeau marched their troops from the outskirts of New York City all the way down to Virginia, where they surrounded Cornwallis by land. Then the French Navy showed up and surrounded him by sea. He eventually had to surrender, and the game was pretty much up. When that happened, support for maintaining the war in Parliament just utterly collapsed, and peace negotiations began.
And let me, having said that somewhat derogatory thing about Washington, let me go the other direction, because the thing that stands out to me, and it took me to become an adult before I appreciated this, but what stands out to me as his greatest hands down contribution, Washington's, is that he could have become king. People wanted him, and yet he did the Cincinnatus thing. And after commanding the army and then serving as president for 2 terms, he walks away. He gives up power.
It's a tremendous thing. So there's an American portrait painter named Benjamin West, who maybe was among these loyalists, or at least a fence sitter, because toward the end of the war, he was in London doing paintings of members of the royal family. And according to his journal, George III asked him to confirm this rumor that he was hearing, that, if the Americans should win this war and win their independence, the rumor was that Washington would actually resign his commission as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and return to private life. And West said, "I've heard the same rumor." And according to West's account, George III said, "If he does that, then truly he is the greatest character of the age." And I think Washington was, because he understood that in some ways the greatest challenge of the war for independence, it wasn't just defeating or outlasting the British. It was creating an army that was powerful enough to defeat or outlast the British, but not so powerful that it would pose a threat to the liberty for which this war was being fought in the first place. And Washington almost had to with his own hands, prevent the officers of the Continental Army snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, because after Yorktown and the army moved back to the Hudson River Valley around Newburgh, New York, there was a conspiracy that is a little bit murky, but it seemed as if some of the officers who had a lot to complain about, they were, grumbling about, many of them hadn't been paid in months, some even years. They wanted the Continental Congress to offer them half pay for life or grants of land. They had a bunch of different demands, and they hatched a plot, some of them, to either march the army west and leave the United States undefended, or some seem to suggest march the army to the Continental Congress and, with their weapons drawn, force the Congress to make good on their demands. I mean, essentially a military coup. Washington got wind of this, and he showed up at a meeting of his officers, and he read them a speech that he had prepared. And then to assure them that, he hadn't forgotten their grievances and he was communicating actively with the members of the Continental Congress, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a letter that he'd received from a member of Congress. But the letter was written in pretty tiny handwriting, and he's squinting down at the paper. And Washington basically says, heck, let's roll. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a pair of glasses. And, you have to realize no one had seen Washington wearing glasses, which in the 18th century were regarded as a real sign of old age and infirmity, except members of his staff, the officers who were closest to him. And he puts on his glasses and he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray, but also blind in the service of my country." And according to people who were present, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. I mean, here were all of these battle-hardened veterans of war, and they begin to sob because, never before had they felt so small, and never before had George Washington seemed so great. I mean, here they were grumbling about pensions and pay, and here was George Washington, who served throughout the army, throughout the war, as commander of the army without pay. He refused a salary. In some ways, he had more to risk than anyone. He had exposed himself to every hardship. He literally had horses shot out from under him in battle. He had sacrificed so much, stood ready to sacrifice so much more. And, here they were, taking a risk that the freedom that they had won could all be scuttled because of their own material desires. I mean, a really great moment for Washington and a really great moment for American history because, of course, what does happen is after the Treaty of Paris is signed, Washington, gradually he dissolves the army and he makes his way down to Annapolis, Maryland, where the Continental Congress was meeting. And on December 23rd, 1783, he resigns his commission as commander-in-chief. And then he gets in a wagon again, and he arrives at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 1783, a private citizen of the free and independent United States.
That's Washington. We started with him. We talked about Jefferson. There's something that stands out in my mind I'd like you to comment on if you can. I spend a lot of time in my new life going around largely rural America, talking about the economy. And of course, I talk about the problems that are going on. And people invariably ask me, is there hope? And to which I say, there is. And I can't tell you what direction it's going to come, but I can tell you that there's something about America and Americans that when we need it, the right people come to the fore. And that leads me to this observation of here we have at Independence a confluence of unbelievable minds coming together. Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Mason, it goes on and on. Were we just lucky? Or is somehow the populace back then much more highly populated with people of that quality than we are today?
That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, we certainly were lucky that we had those individuals representing us at the Continental Congress, or in the case of Mason, actively engaged in the work of the revolution on the colonial and later the state level. I mean, when you think about after Richard Henry Lee's June 7th resolution was introduced, the Continental Congress tabled that motion because they wanted the delegates to be able to communicate with their state assemblies or their colonial assemblies and receive instructions on how they should vote. But on July 10th, it assigned a committee that would draft a declaration if, in fact, the resolution was approved. And that committee includes Adams of Massachusetts, Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania, probably the most famous delegate to the Continental Congress. I mean, this man who literally can pull lightning from the sky. There's Robert Livingston of New York and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And of course, there's Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who I believe was the second youngest delegate to the Continental Congress. He was only 33 years old, and he takes on the task of drafting the Declaration of Independence. There's a fun story told by John Adams that Jefferson thought that Adams should take the lead in drafting it because Adams had been such a vocal advocate for independence and also was about 7 or 8 years his senior. So Jefferson was being deferential, but Adams turned to him and said, "Oh, no, you must do it because reason number one, I, John Adams, am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular, and you are very much otherwise," which is a funny thing for Adams to say about himself. I think there's an element of truth to it. And he certainly was, in some ways, suspected of looking after the interests of Massachusetts and not necessarily those of other colonies, because, of course, Massachusetts was where the war had begun. It had borne the brunt of British sanctions and gunfire. So Massachusetts definitely had a compelling interest in declaring independence. But reason number two, Adams said, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business. Virginia was at the time the most populated and the largest geographically of the colonies. It was sort of in the middle of America. Pennsylvania calls itself the Keystone State, but I think Virginia, has a claim to be the keystone of the colonies as well. If Virginia was known to be on board the cause of independence, then maybe other, colonies like Georgia, South Carolina, Maryland would follow. Um, and then reason number 3, Adams said, "You can write 10 times better than I can." And that's high praise coming from John Adams, who's a good writer. But I will say he's a somewhat long-winded one. And if he had written the Declaration, the thing would probably be 10 pages long. So Jefferson, he wrote the bulk of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote an entire draft. There's evidence that he showed it, at least to Adams and to Franklin. And then there are a couple of corrections, a couple of edits, and then they presented it to the Continental Congress, which after voting on July 2nd for Lee's resolution for independence, then started debating the text of the Declaration. And they made some additional changes, cut out a bunch of what had been written toward the end of the Declaration. This is kind of a neat story. I learned this from a really great book on the Declaration by the late historian Pauline Maier. It's called American Scripture. If you look at the Declaration of Independence and see where it was edited, there are very few edits in the beginning of the Declaration. Most are toward the end. And what she surmised was that Jefferson, like anyone who's a writer, he starts at the beginning. Whenever he sets down his pen and then picks it up again, he starts by rereading the beginning and making edits to it, cleaning it up. And yet he passed through the end of the Declaration fewer times because the end of the Declaration was what he wrote last. And some of our listeners and viewers might remember seeing there's a meme that goes around every 4th of July. It's Thomas Jefferson saying, "Oh crap, that's due tomorrow." I mean, there might be a little bit of truth to that. That the end of the Declaration that Jefferson submitted to the committee and that the committee submitted to Congress was a little bit less polished than the beginning. But then again, we should note that one of the biggest chunks that the Continental Congress axed out of the Declaration was a very long paragraph that Jefferson had written addressing the issue of slavery and the slave trade, condemning it and adding it to the list of charges against the king because so many different colonial legislatures had attempted to either end the importation of slaves to America or tax it so heavily that it would be highly curtailed, and the king consistently refused to give his assent to any of those laws, and so this horrible commerce in human beings was continued, and it's a shame that was taken out of the Declaration. According to Jefferson, it was at the insistence of delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, where slavery was most concentrated. They essentially said, if this remains in, we are out. And at the moment of America's birth, slavery possessed the potential to lead to our disunion. But had it remained in, it would have made very clear what I think the opening paragraphs of the Declaration also make clear, that slavery was utterly inconsistent with the principles on which the United States was founded. And I think there is some good news, which is that the American Revolution was really the beginning of the end of slavery in the United States. I mean, it would take the Civil War to bring it to its ultimate conclusion. But early on, Vermont, which is at this point an independent republic, in 1777, establishes itself through a constitution that outlaws slavery. Massachusetts, in the 1783 court decision, abolishes slavery. Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784 passed bills for gradual emancipation of slaves. And New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania are going to follow. When Jefferson is governor of Virginia, he floats a proposal that Virginia should adopt gradual emancipation. Unfortunately, that measure goes down in defeat. But Americans realize, yes, slavery is not okay. And these human beings, who some of us claim to own, they have rights too. And we need to do what we can to put slavery on the road toward abolition.
We're recording this episode on Juneteenth, which is great that you're saying this. We had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, Tom Krennewitter. We're talking about Juneteenth, and in that discussion, it became so clear to me that, while people will say, well, the American founding is tainted because of slavery, but stop and think about this. This is an institution that is as old as humans themselves. So going back, tens of thousands of years, we didn't put an end to it overnight, which you wouldn't expect for an institution that is that old. But over the course of 80 years, we did. And that's astounding. That, in relatively speaking, that incredibly small period of time, that's it. We put an end to it. And it was started by these people who held up these principles and said, this is the way we're supposed to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first measures that Jefferson proposed when he was elected to the House of Burgesses in 1769, he co-sponsored, I should say, a measure that would have made it legal for Virginians to voluntarily emancipate the enslaved people they owned. But again, that measure was defeated. Jefferson was shouted down as an enemy of Virginia.
Yeah, and so I want to go there because people talk about Jefferson, the hypocrite, that he talks about freedom, but he owned slaves. And my response is, well, hang on a second. You got to put yourself in his position in that time. Of course, today, if one had slaves, it's a matter of saying, hey, this is wrong, stop it. What impediments were in his way that prevented him from just saying, okay, that's it, all my slaves are free?
So for half of his life, it was against the law to free slaves in Virginia. You could sell slaves, but you couldn't free them. In part because Virginia didn't like the idea of there being free Black people. It wanted the distinction between slavery and freedom to be crystal clear. If you were white, you were free. If you were Black, you were enslaved. That changed gradually. There were a couple of different laws that were passed. But all of them had strings attached, and it was never so simple as just snapping your fingers and emancipating your slaves. So one string that was attached was that anyone who was emancipated had 30 days to leave the state of Virginia, unless they were granted some sort of special permission by the legislature, they had to leave. And I mean, here are people, the only thing they would own would be themselves, and that they would have to move to a different state. I mean, that's a huge practical impediment.
Mm-hmm.
There's another string attached, that if you want to emancipate someone, you have to essentially post bond for them. You have to give money to the government in the event that these people should commit crimes or become a burden upon the public in some way. And in Jefferson's case, by the end of his life, he's so deeply indebted that, you can make the argument that he doesn't really own his slaves, that his creditors do. I mean, the story with Jefferson and debt is a long one, but it begins in 1773 when he inherits from his father-in-law land, enslaved people, and a lot of debt. And the land was covered by this 18th century legal practice called entail. And it basically means that the land could be passed from generation to generation, but it could never be sold off. It could never be subdivided. So you couldn't sell the land to pay the debts. All you could hope to do is use the enslaved people to work the land and hope that over time the debts could be discharged. Jefferson never succeeded in doing that. And over the course of his life, he either gained more debts through no fault of his own or gained debt through total fault of his own. I mean, if you've been to Monticello, his house, it is amazing. And it's amazing because he started building it and he liked the design, but then he got new ideas. So he tore down half of what he had built and rebuilt it. And then he furnished it with fine furniture. And some nights as many as 50 people would impose themselves upon him as visitors, and he had to entertain them and, spent a lot of money on wine. I mean, by the time he died on July 4th, 1826, he was in tremendous debt. And, the really sad, really poignant, really ironic thing is that, rather than being able to emancipate his slaves, many of the people he owned were sold off at auction along with all the other possessions that he had that he couldn't, discreetly give to members of his direct family.
And this is worth underlining because we don't have this anymore. But at the time, debts were heritable. That when you die, you leave your debt to somebody. That doesn't happen now, but it was the case then. So all of a sudden, I've been putting aside the fact that he enjoyed a good bottle of wine and spent perhaps more than he had. The fact is, someone else foisted a tremendous amount of debt upon him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. And I think it's true also that, the founding generation, they didn't make a choice to allow slavery around them. I mean, that choice had been made for them, by their ancestors. And in some ways, it's unfair to blame slavery entirely on George III. I mean, he didn't assume the throne until the 1760s. By that point, slavery had been firmly entrenched in what would become the United States. But certainly his ancestors and previous kings and previous members of parliament had helped to establish the transatlantic slave trade. And it wasn't just an English thing, of course. It was a Spanish thing. It was a Portuguese thing. It was a French thing. I mean, all the European nations and many African nations were engaged in the slave trade. And it's so hard for us because the revolution succeeded, because we are a fundamentally free people. It's so hard for us to even imagine owning another person, or even worse, to imagine being owned by another person. And yet for them and for people around the world, as you pointed out, and for people, back into the deepest reaches of our history, it was a normal thing. And so for the revolutionary generation to recognize its wrongness and to adopt as its founding principles beliefs in, equal individual rights, that's the real achievement. That's the headline. That's the thing that we should pay attention to. And that's something I think very much worth celebrating.
Rob, we're coming up to the end, and I'm going to ask you to tell a story in a second. Before I do, I want to give you an opportunity to plug anything you'd particularly like to plug.
That's kind of you. I'm going to, I haven't seen it, so I hope it comes out well, but I'm going to be appearing in a Netflix documentary that I believe is going to drop on June 24th. So it should be available.
Oh my God.
When
I've been watching it. Well, I told you I'm watching this one on Jefferson. I'm thinking, why aren't they interviewing Rob? This is so cool.
So it's called The Great Experiment, and it will be available on Netflix by the time this episode airs.
Oh, superb. That is great.
So that's my plug. I also want to tell one more story. You could edit this out if you need to for purposes of time. I think it's really important when we think about July 2nd and the big decision that was made on that day to reflect on the fact that that decision was no foregone conclusion. And in fact, on July 1st, the Continental Congress took a non-binding test vote. And New York abstained because it had still not heard instructions from its provincial assembly. It abstained on the question of independence. But Pennsylvania voted against it. South Carolina voted against it. And Delaware had a 3-person delegation. One person was absent, and its 2 remaining delegates voted in opposite ways. So Delaware failed to support the resolution for independence on July 1st. But suddenly, somehow, and we really don't know much about this. I mean, it really does remain a mystery. Things began to fall into place. So for Delaware, Caesar Rodney had been absent from the Continental Congress, but he got word that this vote was going to take place through the night, through thunder and lightning. By one account, on horseback, he rode, through these horrible conditions and arrived at the Continental Congress on July 2nd with his boots and spurs still on to swing Delaware into the pro-independence column. Somehow, South Carolina changed its mind over the course of the evening. It seems like their delegate, Edmund Rutledge, was the person who was thinking that this was too much too soon, that we should try to give diplomacy more time to work. He basically acquiesced to the idea of independence, it appears, on the night of July 1st and early in the morning on July 2nd. South Carolina swung its vote in favor of independence. And then Pennsylvania had a delegation that was also pretty deeply divided on the question. On the one hand, you have people like Ben Franklin, who is a member of the committee for drafting the Declaration and a firm supporter of independence. But then again, there was John Dickinson and Robert Morris. And they were not loyalists, it's fair to say. I mean, one of the things that Dickinson would do after independence was become an officer in the Patriot Pennsylvania militia. So he, fought for the cause of independence. But as he said, we are casting our hopes in a skiff made of paper. I mean, this is a really dicey proposition, and it's not a step that we should take lightly. Well, anyway, Dickinson and Morris withdrew from the room in which the Continental Congress was meeting, allowing the majority of the Pennsylvania delegation to vote for independence as well. So on July 2nd, the vote was 12-0, with New York abstaining, and New York, of course, would receive its instructions and soon thereafter make it unanimous. And the Declaration of Independence was then drafted up, and it was formally signed mostly during the first week of August. That's when the parchment was prepared. And at various, moments, members of the Congress would walk into the clerk's office and ascribe their names to this document, which really could have been, if they had been captured by the British, they could have been literally signing their own death warrants.
That's a great story. The story I'd like you to tell, if you will, involves your son Jefferson. And I have known you for so long. Jefferson, I believe he's either at West Point or he just graduated.
He's about to start his sophomore year.
You and I have known each other so long that this story of involving him, and he was a child at the time, I knew you before this story happened. And I don't know how old he was, but he was a little guy. But you know the story I'm talking about.
Yeah, so I hope I don't embarrass him by telling this story, but it's a great story, and sure, let's tell it. So I think he was 3 years old, and my wife and my son and my daughter, who was just a little baby at the time, were in Philadelphia. And Jeff was into a couple of different things. One, he was really into Bob the Builder. So wherever he went, he carried around a Bob the Builder toolkit, which had a plastic hammer and a plastic saw and a plastic drill, etc. And he was really into history. One of the first things that we did when they started watching things was we plonked them down in front of the television and had them watch this really amazing cartoon that PBS produced now probably 30 years ago called Liberty's Kids. I highly recommend it to anyone out there who might be parents of kids. I think it's just absolutely terrific and a really great way to teach history of the American Revolution to your children. Well, anyway, we go to Philadelphia, we see Independence Hall, we go to the Betsy Ross house, we cut out paper stars. I think we visited the Constitution Center. We had dinner at the City Tavern, which is a recreated restaurant where the Continental Congress had taken its meals. And, I looked at my watch and it was almost 7:00. And that's when Jeff said, "The Liberty Bell. I want to see the Liberty Bell." So, we hurried over to the Liberty Bell Pavilion thinking that it might be closed. It was almost 7. But it was still open, just barely. We were like the last people through the door. And as we're looking at the Liberty Bell, one of the rangers there said, "Do you want me to let them touch the bell?" And I thought two things. I thought, is this how our federal government preserves our historic treasure? And I also thought, heck yes, I want him to touch the bell. Terrific, thank you. So Jeff touched the bell. I snapped a photo of it. And as we were leaving, as we were walking back to our hotels, I could hear my 3-year-old son mumbling something in the way that 3-year-olds do. And I leaned down and I said, "What's the matter, buddy?" And he said, "It's cracked, Daddy. It's cracked." He saw the huge crack on the side of the Liberty Bell. That very much disturbed him. But then he kind of brightened up and he stood up straight and, holding his Bob the Builder toolkit, and he said, I'll fix it. I'll fix it with my tools. And Ant, I want to say it's always such a pleasure to speak with you. And it's always a pleasure to listen to Words and Numbers. And I really want to thank you and James on behalf of other members of your audience. I'm one of them, for providing us with the tools that we need to preserve and restore and repair our liberty. And, your Facebook group is terrific. And, it's a model, I think, of the sort of civilized, polite, generous discussion that we as Americans need. And we're not always going to agree on everything, but if we could just agree to be agreeable, I think that will make the somewhat messy process of representative government a whole lot more pleasant and a whole lot more workable.
Thank you, Rob. That's very kind, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure always.